176,000 years ago, deep within a cave in southern France, a place where no human had ever seen or had set foot. There, a group of Neanderthals entered, and they did something unprecedented in the archaeological record. Now, they must have already been familiar with the cave, as they knew where to go. They walked to the back of it, and there, about 100 metres in, or 300 feet, there was a hole which they crawled through into another chamber, and they went further and further back until they were more than 300 metres or 1,000 feet from the cave entrance. At this point in the cavern they were in, it would have been absolutely pitch black, and so they made lights from bones with animal fat on them. And then they broke hundreds of stalagmites, making each piece the same length, and then organised these pieces into two large ring-like structures. Alongside these were smaller piles of stalagmite pieces, and again these pieces were all of the same length. And on these rings they placed more lights using animal fat. This would have taken hours of work, possibly days, and this means that doing this was no accident. There was nothing else like this in the world, not at the time anyway, and nothing came close to it for another 150,000 years. Not even early modern humans built anything similar. This was a dark and cramped journey. The air would have been thick with the smell of burning animal fat. So what encouraged these Neanderthals to do this? Why break hundreds of stalagmites to the same size? Why arrange them in rings? Why light fires on them? And why so far back inside a cave where nothing would usually go? This creation can be found in Bruniquel cave, and this wasn't the result of some random act. It required planning, coordination, an understanding of what was being made, an understanding of what the final construction would look like. It required the ability to communicate how long each piece of stalagmite must be, organisation to sort them into similar sized piles. And so the conclusion we have to draw from this is that these Neanderthals were not only showing thought and planning, but they must have had the ability to communicate about this complex task. Not only because of what was required, but because it was so dark that any other form of communication other than a vocal one would have been very challenging in these conditions. And this is interesting, as when most people think about Neanderthals, they would often imagine a silent world, perhaps a world of grunts and gestures and little else. There's been much debate amongst academics over whether Neanderthals could talk, and if they did, how complex was their language. But what I'm going to show here is how archaeological stories, the record we find across Europe and in the Near East, can tell us a story about how Neanderthals left traces of their behaviour that are just not possible without complex communication. It suggests that Neanderthals could communicate in complex ways, and if they could do this, could they tell stories? And if so, could they have shared those stories with modern humans? And perhaps most interesting of all is, if this is all true, then perhaps our oldest stories are older than modern humans and older than Neanderthals, and so over 500,000 years old. I'm John White, a specialist in mythology, and my work helps scholars and universities around the world do research into understanding the age and origins of humanity's stories. And today I'll look at the origins of language by examining the archaeological record to see if we can trace the origins of storytelling and complex language. So if this sounds interesting to you, then grab yourself a cup of tea and welcome to Krakenford. Whilst there's much in the archaeological record that supports the fact that Neanderthals could speak, and current research shows confidence that they could probably pronounce vowels like a, e and u, and consonants like t and m and k, there is still much scepticism on whether they could actually put these together to use and make a complex language. And so, rather than look at the biology and physiology of Neanderthals, as many do, I wanted to take a different approach and to look at some of the amazing things Neanderthals achieved during their existence, and then discuss other aspects of that that could give us confidence that they could speak in a complex manner. And perhaps the best place to start is with the most primitive of technology, fire. In Péche de l'Azay in France, archaeologists have recovered lumps of a chemical, MnO2, manganese dioxide to you and I. Now, this was recovered from a site used by Neanderthals, and this isn't any old manganese because MnO2 combusts at low temperatures, and Neanderthals were using this specifically on wood for fires. The result is that fires were easier to start, and this is not something you do by accident. This is something that is found out through experimentation, repeated experimentation, and then transmission of that skill in terms of finding it and using it, and an understanding of cause and effect. And Neanderthals were doing this repeatedly. And how could they do this if they weren't talking to each other? There's more. The dyeing of cloth and the making of paints might not seem like a complex task, but at the same site of Péche de l'Azay, ochre and manganese pieces show shape used by abrasion, as though being used on the ground, essentially like crayons to draw, and they would leave marks like crayons. So what were Neanderthals drawing? Well, I'll come to that in a bit, but we also see in Ukraine, in Crimea, studies that have confirmed Neanderthals shaped pieces of ochre into very pointed tools for drawing, not crayon-like drawings, but what we would consider fine lined art. This was deliberate tooling, and a decision was made for that deliberate tooling for the purpose of drawing. But also, drawing wasn't the only thing we see Neanderthals doing with these coloured pigments. We find a more general use of colour in Păstura Chioli, Romania, where a geode was found painted red and black, with ochre being used, and ochre was regularly used by Neanderthals for the red colour. Now, there doesn't seem to be a practical function to the painting of this geode. Perhaps it was just purely decorative, or perhaps an archaeologist with no other explanation would say it's a ritual object. But either way, it shows that Neanderthals may have had a curiosity in these things, even if they weren't practical. And so this really suggests Neanderthals were using colour pigments, using them symbolically and consistently. And this isn't something you do by accident. It is taught. It is, how to do this is spread across groups of Neanderthals. And we've seen Neanderthals using colour, well, for over 250,000 years. In Krapina, Croatia, some eagle talons have been found, dated to around 130,000 years old. These show clear evidence of being polished and crafted and tied together so as they could be worn as a necklace. And this necklace would represent one of the earliest pieces of jewellery ever found in Europe. And this use of jewellery has been continued in Europe by Neanderthals, where we see a 40,000-year-old necklace discovered in Cova Foradada in Spain. These bones had deliberate cut marks and were almost certainly used in, say, a necklace. So what we would like to ask ourselves is, why necklaces? Well, necklaces would have had, a status effect, or some symbolism associated with them at least, or potentially both. And we see this today in modern humans. We see them in uniforms being worn, or if people want attention, And something else that would fall into this sort of category of use, we find in Cueva dos los Aviones in Spain, we see seashells that have been found that were used as pigment containers, like primitive makeup cases, and perforated shells were used in cosmetic production. And the date of these is over 115,000 years old, which is double the age of similar findings in the modern human archaeological record. And the shell we're looking at here for carrying the cosmetics was found over 100 kilometers away from where it was probably sourced. So someone saw it and carried it for a purpose because they liked the look of the shell. So not only is the manufacturing of the cosmetics requiring skill, there is a wearing of them as a symbology and a status within a community, and so the community must be aware of seeing that and having a view of the status and symbology. There must have been communication within a group of Neanderthals to understand all this at a minimum. Now, one of the more debated claims of Neanderthal intelligence is focused on cave paintings. And there are a few caves where we see such paintings. La Pasiega, Montervieso and Ardales in Spain. We find paintings that have provisionally been dated to older than 64,000 years. And if this is confirmed through different analysis, we can say with confidence that these predate modern humans coming to the region, which means someone other than modern humans must have painted them. And that must have been the Neanderthals. The paintings we see include hand stencils, there's ladder-like symbolism, fine line work and symbology, some of which has no real clear recognisable meaning. Most of this is also made in red ochre. Now, I must admit, when I first saw this image on the screen, I thought on the right-hand side, is that a helicopter? Or perhaps it was the time machine from the 1960 movie of the same name. And it obviously can't be. Or if the time machine was real, it perhaps can, but let's be serious here. What our brain does when it sees shapes, we often see patterns where there are none. And so within this example, what we can definitely see is that of an animal, or at least the back half of one, maybe a bovine, looking at that shape, and it looks like it's trapped in a fenced-off area. But again, we have no archaeological record of Neanderthals ever trapping animals in areas, ever doing this. Now, the dating of the paintings is debated, and as things currently stand, it does suggest that they were made by Neanderthals over 10,000 years before humans were engaging in this kind of art, and certainly probably 20,000 years before humans come to Spain. And as we get more evidence to support these dates, I think we should be in a position to ask ourselves, what do these images represent? They look like recognisable shapes, but the meaning of them? Well, for now we can only guess at the meaning of them. Probably a little less impressive to the eye than paintings are engravings, and two have been found which are worth noting. The first was found in Gorham's Cave, Gibraltar, which was a large cross-hatched carving which has been made deep into the bedrock of the cave, and it was found underneath sediments that were dated to around 39,000 years ago. Experimentation with this bedrock has shown that to recreate that drawing would have taken hundreds of strokes from a stone. This is a very deliberate act, not something you'll do being bored, although the image itself does seem to be abstract, although who knows what Neanderthals are thinking at the time, what is going on. We also see another engraving found on a bone that belongs to a deer, and this engraving looks a little like chevrons, and archaeologists have been able to determine that the bone was boiled and prepared before being carved, and this shows a deliberate and planned act by its Neanderthal creator, an understanding of how to make a bone easy to carve. It shows experience in a process of making the bone softer. And so what we can say, seeing these paintings and these carvings, is that, well, there aren't many of them, and so we have probably lost many of them to the elements and to time. And that's really sad. And it's the same with modern human paintings. Many of them have been lost to time. But the rare examples we do have really show that Neanderthals had consideration in that craft, and they had forethought and process. And then, in some instances, they must have communicated that to other members of the group, other Neanderthals. How did they do that? Probably talking. These things are not one-offs. They are not random events. They take many attempts and generational knowledge that would have been passed down. But there is one thing I've left until last that really, seals the deal for me in terms of believing Neanderthals could talk. And that is the ritual around death. You see, death could be emotional. If you talked about it, you're talking about feelings. You're talking about things subjectively rather than an objective and factual thing. And subjective talk allows for more complex dialogue. If it would happen, if someone dies, you're very upset. There are all sorts of thoughts going on, especially with someone who's close to you. So how did Neanderthals deal with death? What can we see in their mortuary behaviour that allows us to understand if they communicated? Now, for us, we're quite lucky that there are a number of examples of burial practice for Neanderthals. One particularly important one is 60,000 years ago and found in La Chapelle-aux-Sens in France. Here, a pit was deliberately dug for a body, which was placed in it in a very deliberate position, and with it, items look like they were deliberately placed. It is probably our best evidence for a deliberate burial, but there are still some who believe that this is a controversial opinion. For us, we should ask, why did Neanderthals do this? What were they thinking? Did they believe in another world, an underworld? Why were items placed in the pit with the body? Did they believe in the afterlife? Or was it just to hide a body from scavengers, predators? Well, the deliberate placement and the grave goods suggest a burial wasn't rushed. It wasn't there to hide the body. There must have been planning and thought. In this process, people must have talked about how to position the body, how to put it into the pit. It may also help to know that the person who died was around 60 years old and had suffered poor health. Someone who lived a relatively long time, Neanderthal-wise, probably had a number of relatives within the group, probably had a lot of people who had a lot of feelings when they died. And there's one other example, a really interesting example of a deliberate burial, and that's in Shanidar Cave, Iraq. And this burial is dated to 90,000 years ago, so 30,000 years earlier. Now, there is again controversy here, but what we see are, in this region, multiple burials over time. Deliberate placement of bodies, deliberate placement of burial goods, and we can tell looking at the bodies that some of these individuals were sick and injured during their lifetime and must have been taken care of to be healed so they could carry on having a life. And what is also interesting is we see modern humans burying their dead here in a similar time period, in a similar way. And that raises a very interesting question of whether modern humans and Neanderthals were exchanging knowledge on burial practices, and if they were, how and why. What is also interesting is about this specific Neanderthal burial is that because the person or people have been seen as being ill and sick, people must have cared for them, and to care for someone requires communication, requires sort of a feeling and caring and empathy. And so we could believe that burying someone, you would have a similar feeling, similar empathy. There are emotions going on here. So this particularly allows us to ask the question, how much did Neanderthals talk? And perhaps in parentheses, did they talk to modern humans? What I've tried to show here is that Neanderthals were not brutish and ignorant people, but they were people very similar to ourselves. They cared for one another. They had creative expression. They had emotions about people being sick and dying, and that they performed complex tasks repeatedly. And the question we want to answer is, how could you do that if you couldn't speak? Now, the fact is that many studies about speech in Neanderthals focus on the physiology and have shown that Neanderthals could pronounce key vowel and consonant sounds. They could speak. But what we can't show is that, did they have any complex language? We cannot recreate the language or the syntax of the Neanderthals, and we have no proof that they passed on any language or words or rituals to humans. But we do have some possibilities. To start with, if modern humans can speak complex language, which we can, and our direct ancestors emerged out of Africa 50,000 years ago, could they have taught the Neanderthals to speak? Well, the fact is Neanderthals have been in Europe and Western Asia for over 400,000 years, long before modern humans. Yes, some modern humans left Africa before this, but they never settled, never formed long-lasting communities. But even before this, Neanderthals were showing complex behaviours, such as in Bruniquel cave. And if Neanderthals were performing these acts, then they must have been talking for longer than modern humans have been around. And that means that perhaps it is the ancestor of modern humans and Neanderthals that first talked. They may not have talked with the complexity we do, or that the Neanderthals did, but the vocal cords, the bones were well on their way to evolving to have the ability to make key sounds we need for complex language. And so I think the evidence to suggest Neanderthals didn't talk is now in the absolute minority. We do believe they spoke, and we do believe they had the ability to make complex sounds. We just don't know if they had a complex language. But we also know that if their language was like ours, that language over the course of maybe 5,000 years or so would change dramatically to be unrecognisable. In fact, we only have a few words we call ultra conserved that may be 15 to 20,000 years old. Most of them are common words like you and me and I. We do have a few unusual words like worm, which means a snake, or possibly used as dragon. We do have bark and ash. They were keywords. But the oldest word we have, which is probably over 20,000 years old, is one. Although in the English language that would be now digit, but the equivalent of what was one is probably the oldest word we still can recognise today amongst a global language, as though there was a common origin of that. Now, one of the other things to argue against complex language for Neanderthals is that the environment didn't necessarily encourage complex language. It isn't like they had 5 remote controls to operate or like to read books on quantum mechanics. The complexity would come, I think, with more emotions and feelings when you're taken outside a physical world and your imagination, you wanted to explain that. That's when complexity comes in. And they obviously had imagination, and they had that complexity because they created art. So the question I guess we have then is that everything points to the fact that they could have complex language even if we can't prove it. But how or did they interact with humans? So we see 2 examples of this happening. One with the burials at 90,000 years ago, where we see Neanderthals and modern humans having the same or very similar burial practices in the same place, which could be coincidental. It could be that Neanderthals saw humans do something and they decided to copy it. We see that humans had burials in Africa before that time. We also see Neanderthals had some mortuary behaviour before that time. So perhaps the art of mortuary behaviour comes from the ancestors of modern humans and Neanderthals as well. But then we also have a period of 50,000 years ago when modern humans, who people out of Africa are descended from, they interacted with Neanderthals and bred, and we all have a little Neanderthal DNA in us, various amounts. So how did humans breed with Neanderthals? Was that a process of us communicating with them, or was something more forceful going on, something more horrific? We can't tell for sure. It shows that we must have interacted at some level, albeit I would like to hope it was a more friendly level than not. But the fact is that if modern humans and Neanderthals have over 200,000 years of separation between them, language has developed so much. As I say, it's 5,000 years and language will change almost completely, that Neanderthals and humans talking the same language is just so unlikely, it's probably could be considered impossible. In fact, even today, in modern humans, we have languages that are completely different from the two languages of Southern Africa, which sounds like this, to the Ubik language of the Caucasus, which sounds like this. You see, one uses clicks and the other has over 80 consonants. There's near zero phonetic similarity. You would have to work off facial expressions and body language and drawings. It's not impossible to communicate, but it is very challenging. So I feel that is how Neanderthals and modern humans would have communicated. In a nutshell, facts are that whilst we have Neanderthal art that seems considered, and we see constructions and technology and ritual that suggest they did talk about complex things, they had complex emotions, we just cannot recover the Neanderthal language. We never will, and we cannot reconstruct their grammar. But the behavioural evidence is strong, because they did these things, made pigments and jewellery, engraved symbols, cared for the injured, buried the dead. We know there was emotional thought in there. We know they almost certainly could talk, and this makes them much closer to humans than I think many people really consider. But this evidence of talking, as I say, probably comes, originally from our common ancestor who lived, well, he's still out for debate, but 1.2 to 1.5 million years ago, we seem to have a common ancestor. And that common ancestor almost certainly could speak in a very primitive manner at least. And so did that ancestor speak and have emotions and tell stories? There isn't much evidence to say they did. We haven't found that. But much like Neanderthals have emotions and modern humans have emotions, perhaps they did like stories and they told the same stories as us. And if that is the case, if our ancestor was telling stories, then those stories would be over 1 million years old. So I guess what people want to know is, what stories were Neanderthals telling if they were telling stories? And as I've just hinted at, they probably had the same hopes and the same fears, very similar emotions to modern humans. And the earliest stories we have for modern humans are around why are we here, are around why do we die, are around how to successfully hunt. And I talk about all these on my channel. If you don't subscribe to my channel, please do, and you'll see access to how I understand the origins of our earliest stories. As I say, this work is academic, is used by universities across the world. It is supported by patrons of the channel, and if you want to support my research, feel free to join Patreon or YouTube membership. It will go straight into research and the development of the mythology and folklore database, which you can all use for free. So, to me, Neanderthals were storytellers. They spoke a different language to modern humans, so I'm very sure they didn't tell stories that humans then adopted, or vice versa. I think that's very unlikely. But they did see actions, and they could copy those actions. And so that is where we are. Neanderthals were storytellers. We've just lost their stories. Take care. Toodle pip.